Before we dive into our questions, I'd like to share the publisher's description of this book so that our audience has that context. Years of political violence and protests against injustice have revived interest in teaching civics in schools. The problem? Civic education, as it currently exists, privileges systems, not students. It promotes incremental change within a broken democracy rather than responding to the youth-led movements that call for the abolition of inequitable social structures. What will it take to prepare young people for the just future they are fighting for? Civics for the World to Come offers educators a framework for designing the critical civic education that our students deserve. Synthesizing perspectives on democratic life from critical race theory, ethnic studies, Afrofuturism, and critical literacy, the book presents key practices for cultivating youth civic agency grounded in equity and justice. The authors explore 5 world-building civic skills: inquiry, storytelling, imagination, networking, and advocacy, and introduce readers to real learning communities where students and educators are transforming themselves and society. Well, I am a huge fan of this book, as evidenced by the poster that I have. So I'm really excited for you all to be here today, and I can't thank you enough for joining us in this conversation. So I'd like to get started by having you tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to write this book. Why are these conversations needed now, and how have your backgrounds as classroom teachers shaped this work?
Yes, thank you so much, Megan. It's so wonderful to be here, and we're excited to be part of the conversation for Media Literacy Week. I think, as you said, both of us are high school English teachers. That's our background. And I feel like we had a conversation about who we were when we were starting out our careers. And I think we did not have the language of world building in our vocabulary. At that point, we were just English teachers struggling against the boundaries that we are often put in as teachers of disciplines, the little boxes that the students go through day by day, moving from English class to math class to science class to social studies class. And I think anyone out there that teaches knows that it feels a little bit confining at times when you know that the issues that young people bring to the classroom, the things that they're consuming in the media, don't fit into these disciplinary boxes. And so when I thought about my students at the end of the school year, when I'd be signing their yearbooks, thinking about what I wanted them to take with them as they move forward into life, I didn't think about the discrete skills of literacy instruction. I thought about how they could use their voices to advocate for themselves and for their communities in an unjust world. And I think that when this is being recorded and when we are going to be talking about it, we obviously know the world is in a really heavy place right now. There's a lot of suffering. And so when I think about the purpose of education and the purpose of teaching and learning, I think about civics. And it took a long time for me to embrace that because, again, we are taught that we are just one thing. I'm an English teacher. I'm not a civics teacher because that is something that happens in one particular discipline. But I think what we want to argue with this book is the idea that every single one of us is a civics teacher, because every choice that we make in the classroom in terms of the content we teach, the voices we include and the voices we exclude, the way we see our students as developing leaders who are going to build a future that we cannot yet envision, that is the true work of education. And if we take that as the true work of education, it necessarily changes everything about how we plan, how we teach, how we assess, because we can't simply keep integrating young people into a world that they know and that we know is not worthy of them, and that needs a different orientation toward the future. So I think we wanted to bring this out as a way for all teachers to see that they have a role to play in helping the young people they serve to build a new world.
I'm gonna have to disagree vehemently with my colleague. I wish that was the case. Actually, it's just if I turn this into a debate, but that's not the case. I think obviously I agree with kind of the sentiments of what Nicole's framing here. I think the other thing I'll add is maybe a sense of unrest or discomfort with the ways oftentimes people in academia spend our time. Right? We write for very finite, small audiences. These very boring journal. Nicole and I have done a bunch of this. Right? We'll write a bunch of these journal articles that have billions of semicolons and APA citations about what needs to happen in classrooms, and so often that work never actually reaches classroom practices. So we've spent over a decade at this point, really focused on civic education in ELA contexts, in cross-disciplinary approaches, and really trying to imagine, what are the possibilities in classrooms, and feeling frustrated with the tensions that are happening in U.S. schooling contexts. And so, I think the other kind of aim, at least for like a selfish aim for me, is how can we distill the work we've been doing for so long in a way that addresses what are the worlds that could come in classrooms right now? What are the kinds of approaches we might all take? And so, this is kind of an intentional shift from the insular world of academia towards kind of being in conversation with the people we were in the past, right? As in some ways, I'm writing to the Antero and Nicole of yore, right? Of the back in the day when we used to be classroom teachers, as well as for teachers today, right? I think to kind of echo a sentiment that Nicole was saying, this is a tremendously difficult time to be a teacher, right? I do not envy the kind of insurmountable task of being a teacher and talking about the kinds of suffering that is happening right now, and thinking about that from a media literacy lens, thinking about that from a civic lens, from personal and social responsibility. And for us, part of what speculative and dreaming means, as caught in this book, is about thinking about how we might move past the given horizons right now.
I love that idea about, thinking about what the given horizons are. Is that sort of what you mean with the title and this idea about the world to come? I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and where that idea comes from.
Yeah, I think that there's this when you review kind of the standards and the curriculum that's often set out for civic education or democratic education in general, there's often this idea of, let's learn about how the systems we currently have work, because there's this idea of incremental change and constant forward progress, that if more young people knew the normative set of knowledge and skills about how democracy works in this country, or how systems of government work, that everyone will be able to then use those levers in ways to slowly move our world toward, harmony and justice for all. And I think that, folks that are, looking at the history of justice movements and are looking at kind of where our society is today, can see that that's a very flawed narrative. And anyone that works with young people know that they have a very highly honed sense of fairness and justice, and they know viscerally, even if they don't know the exact terms or the exact structures and knowledge that we're talking about, they know that something is wrong. And I would say that this predates the pandemic, but I think the pandemic really has driven home for all of us, and especially for young people, that they are looking for a purpose. That the world is not okay. They are not okay. We are not okay. And that we need our education spaces to not just be spaces where we say, ignore all that and just sit in this vacuum and learn the structures that have always been, and learn to integrate yourself into the world as it is, and hope that you can succeed in this very broken world that we're living in. I think all of us that work with young people or that have young people in our lives know that narrative is simply not sufficient. It doesn't respect young people and their ingenuity. It doesn't respect the kinds of media that they are producing, let alone seeing around them. And so for us, when we think about the world to come, we use that as a phrase to remind us that schools are really a place where we, as adults, we give a home to our best intentions or our best hopes that the future will be different and better than the world that we're currently living in. And if we remind ourselves of that, then why would we keep teaching things that are simply about the system as it is? Why would we not treat school as a place, an incubator, to use some of that tech language, for kind of like eliciting for young people discussions about the things they care about, opportunities to connect across difference, opportunities to build the world that they deserve, because that's where we're going to find hope. That's where we're going to find purpose, and the kind of the struggle toward the world that they deserve, instead of simply resigning ourselves to teaching what we taught yesterday, hoping that it's going to matter. So I think, to me, the world to come is what gives me and the students that I work with, in a very despairing time, a sense of purpose and a reason for moving forward, because education can be a transformative force at the same time that it can be reproductive if we're not careful.
And I think I'll just add some of the origins of our framing of the world to come, and of this kind of speculative idea of thinking of an otherwise, right? Thinking of rather than taking the given conditions, but allowing young people to dream other kinds of possibilities, really is informed by fiction, by storytelling, some of the commitments that are in the book, but as well as, I think Afrofuturism, just want to name like very specifically, is a very kind of important way that we think about, the ways we connect historical injustices and historical understandings of the given world as ways to dream up new worlds. So it's not purely, soda in the water fountain in the hallway, right? Or whatever the kinds of close secular dreaming, maybe this is not the right language, but rather kind of thinking through like what are the ways that we build off of historical inequity, right? Like that our dreaming is bound towards a particular kind of past, and kind of using that to rocket into different kinds of directions is an important kind of foundation that we're thinking about.
And this sort of speculative thinking and imagination is obviously really key to the book. And you place imagination with 4 other civic skills in the text: inquiry, storytelling, of course, imagination, networking, and advocacy. And I'd love to hear more about those concepts and why they are sort of appropriate for framing the work and framing it in this current moment.
Yeah, and kind of building on what we were discussing around like the way curriculum usually looks, or the way that disciplinary frameworks often look. It often starts with like, here's a body of knowledge, here's a body of skills, and just figure out how to teach those. And we decided we didn't want to start with a body of, there's not a step-by-step guide to how to build, the world to come. And so we wanted to focus on this idea of commitments or habits of mind or practices that transcend disciplinary boundaries, that are something that every teacher and every young person can be practicing. Because like we said, and like Antero was just saying, the theories that we're drawing from here, this is not imagination for imagination's sake. This is not simply a thought exercise, like, wouldn't it be nice if we lived in this world? This is not simply dreaming. Dreaming is a key component of the struggle to make the future happen. And so we take it like this is very serious work at the same time that it's play. It's very serious because there's a purpose here that we're working toward. And so we think of these 5 skills or these 5 commitments as things that all of us can adapt and integrate into our work. And we kind of think of it as like inquiry is kind of, why are things this way? But the fundamental question that young people and teachers start with, why am I seeing what I'm seeing around me? Why am I seeing the suffering? Why am I seeing inequity? Whose stories need to be heard? And this is where also the connections to analyzing media and analyzing power in media really gets to this idea of what voices are being heard in a conversation, what voices are being amplified in the media. How can we connect with each other? So that's the connection part. If we're gonna ask questions about the world, we're going to explore the stories that are being heard. Now, how do I connect with others to actually work together to build this world that I'm hoping for? What kind of future do we want to build together? We are not under the impression that this is an easy task. We have different values as individuals living in this nation state and across this world, but we do have to live together. We have to figure out a way to do so in ways that foreground certain visions of the future, certain values, and certain ethics. And then how do we get there? And so those are kind of the questions that underlie those 5 skills. And that's how we kind of organize the book, because everyone, no matter what discipline they teach, no matter what grade level you teach, those questions and those commitments are things that can undergird all of our practice and kind of give more of a purpose for young people to see why they're learning the things they're learning in the classroom, instead of just presenting content because that's what the curricular standards say.
There's an overarching 6th commitment here too, right? That I want to kind of like be very deliberate about, and that is this committing to being a civics educator in classrooms, committing to democracy in your classroom. When we say that every teacher is a civics teacher, I want to make sure people really understand that this is, I think, what we think is probably one of the most important tasks that every teacher needs to take up, and oftentimes it's just not treated as what schooling is for. And so I want to kind of sit in this for a minute and kind of be very clear that if you are an elementary teacher, you are a civics teacher. If you're a math teacher, you're a civics teacher. If you're in a subject area, if you're a PE teacher, you are a civics teacher. And what I mean by that is every lesson in classrooms, right? The ways we discipline young people, the kinds of ways we orient towards school structure and schedule and bells, the kinds of ways that we engage in the scientific method, all of these guide young people towards particular kinds of ways to participate in society. And so when we think about being a civics teacher, to me, this is the fundamental role of what happens in schools, right? And so this is the kind of meta sixth commitment that kind of ties all of these other pieces together. And in doing that, right, you may not you might rankle with that, right? Our teacher education programs don't tend to focus on civics. And we tend to imagine civics as this kind of one thing about three branches of government and the kind of formulaic business of what happens in a functioning U.S. democracy. But that does not harbor a new kind of pathway for young people and for some kind of beacon to quote unquote fix the given conditions. And so when we talk about being a civic teacher, a teacher of civics, right, this is about trying to think about how are we going to be and how are we going to be outside of the conditions of schooling as they presently are. And so that feels like just to name like the kind of unspoken commitment that wraps all of this around. Just want to make sure that hopefully we're being clear on this.
Yeah, that is so important. And one thing that I didn't put on our list to talk about, but I think it's probably relevant here is, this idea of, what committing to that looks like. Your book really explores that through real case studies, through groups of students, through, a debate group, learning communities, where you've actually sort of seen these things in action and sort of seen potential to build on it. And I think that's really probably important for people to hear. I know as a former classroom teacher who's also been in higher ed, sometimes the jump from, practice to thinking about these ideas feels really big, but you've seen this work in action in some of those student communities. And I don't know if you want to take a quick moment to just talk about that and how your work with students and some of the communities you talk about in the group, this is really shored up your ideas in this text.
Yeah, I think that the being in relationship with young people and with educators and with community members and with each other, I think has been, I think when we talk about what it takes to do this work, I think that going it alone is never the way. And so for anyone out there that's like wondering how to take the first step, we talk about small steps being the pathway to radical acts. And a lot of this is about finding other people that share a common interest, even if it's just one piece of it, and moving forward. So I think we've been very lucky. Antero and I met back in like 2008 when we were starting our doctoral program together at UCLA. We were both coming out of the classroom, English teachers, and we found that we had similar commitments, similar values, and we were lucky enough to be able to start working together, and then to keep ourselves connected to the classroom even when we were no longer classroom teachers. We were teacher educators, so now we teach teachers before they go into the classroom. And I think staying connected to different kinds of groups, whether it's an after-school debate club or an in-school classroom project, or like kind of like a community citizen science project, I think those kinds of projects are what reminds us that the theory can sound very overwhelming sometimes, but when you work with young people on the ground, when you work with teachers on the day-to-day and work within the constraints that we find ourselves in, but don't let those define us. Like we talk about that as pragmatic idealism. So we don't just let sometimes, whatever context you work within, we know that we are, especially as classroom teachers, we are constantly being bombarded with scarcity mindset. We're constantly being, our practice is restricted in so many ways based on mandates and policies and so many different things, that it can be easy to narrow our vision of what is possible. But as soon as we start to preemptively narrow our vision of what's possible, we've already kind of lost half the game. Teachers also know that when we close our doors or when we get to work, we can do a lot more than we often are, or maybe seen that we could. So I think for us, we see it as start with the big vision, start with people that share your crazy vision, and then work within the constraints that you have. But there are things we can do to start that forward. And so we've been really lucky to both find communities that we have been able to become trusted members of, that we write about, and also to create some communities together with young people and teachers that are interested in this work. So we really try to bring it down to this doesn't have to seem overwhelming. You don't need to throw away everything you've ever done. There are ways that you can use the amazing genius and wealth of what's around you to start doing this work today.
Right. And maybe I'll just add that it can be really scary to do the kind of work that Nicole's describing, right? That particularly right now, it is hard to be a teacher who wants to try to do something new, depending on the kinds of teaching context you're in, right? These might be particularly restrictive times that really limit the kinds of content you're allowed to teach, the kinds of texts you're allowed to access, the kinds of activities and conversations you're allowed to have in your classroom. And we know that young people are hungry for, powerful new kinds of learning. We know that your colleagues down the hall are also excited to try something new, and that oftentimes we're letting fear dictate what happens in classrooms in ways that I think our young people are who are going to lose out as a result of this, and our profession, right? We're going to lose more and more teachers as a result of, I think, what's happening in this country right now. And so kind of recognizing, the ways to name one kind of inequity, right? The ways that anti-Blackness have shaped US schooling, who's in schools, who are teachers, who are teacher leaders. What are the ways that your classroom practice might take up a commitment, like the 5 commitments that Nicole talked about, and think through the inequities of anti-Blackness in your own given school community, right? Feels like an important kind of recognition for us to kind of think through, right? We can name these pieces and we can think about inquiry and storytelling around a particular kind of issue. I say all this to say it is important to recognize that as scary as teaching is, our kind of case studies that run throughout this book really point to the fact that you are never teaching alone and in a silo, right? Even if you are one teacher in a school building, you're one teacher with a classroom of hungry learners who are willing to do the work alongside you, right? There's a community outside the walls of your classroom who's ready to do this work with you. There's a network of teachers who, if they're not even at your school, they're available on Zoom in different kinds of time zones and are willing to do this work with you, right? And we point to resources on how to connect across these kinds of dimensions. And so as scary as this is, I think we find courage in being able to do this work together. And just want to name that your context is not an excuse to shy away from our civic responsibilities.
And one thing I really loved in the text is how you sort of balanced that acknowledgement of like context and the constraints of teachers with increasingly, gentle but increasingly forceful prodding of like moving beyond that as an excuse. And I really love that. I
forceful
think
prodding, that's gonna be our other working title for the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly what resonated so much with me. And my husband is an educator, and we talked a lot about the book because it is easy as an educator, I think, in any space to feel overwhelmed by those constraints. So kudos, I think, on the gentle moving into like, more appropriately forceful prodding on that. But you also give really specific action items, right? Things that teachers can actually tangibly do in their classrooms to transform their practice. And, you can talk about any ones that you want, but one that specifically stood out to me was the inventory, content inventory. And so I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about what that looks like and how that can be a specific, starting point to move a classroom towards more just practices.
I feel like I keep answering every question first. Antero, do you want to start off on this one?
You're doing great. This is great because I get to just like, well, actually this and mansplain things after the fact.
No, I think this gets back to our conversation about the small moves. Like, we don't need to throw everything out, or civics is not one more thing to pile on top of all of our other responsibilities. If we make the idea of civic learning the foundation of what we do, then that just makes everything more streamlined. So it doesn't have to be an extra thing. But one way that we suggest we could start on a small scale, no matter if you're a classroom educator or a nonprofit educator, any of the work that we do, is doing an inventory of kind of the texts or the whatever the resources are that you work with when you're working with your audience. What do you see when you do an inventory of that? Because sometimes we have commitments and we espouse certain values, but just because of the contradictions of life, because of the overwhelming nature of our media landscape, we could sometimes not realize that our commitments and our ethics are not always lining up with the resources that we actually are using. And maybe it's because we haven't really thought about the book room in our school for a while, and we don't realize that when we do an inventory and say, okay, whose voices do I see in the things that I am putting in front of young people? Because if I truly believe that the things I'm putting in front of them, in terms of the voices of the authors of the people writing the different things that you are asking young people to analyze and read, maybe I don't realize that all of those resources, for the most part, are coming from a particular population. Like maybe, in English language arts, we have the ongoing canon wars about the novels that we read, and dead white men being like the overwhelming nature of the novels that are being taught in schools. So I need to step back as an English teacher and say, hold on, like, do I say that I care about creating a more just world with my young people, but the only voices they're seeing along that journey are from one particular community? Because then I need to step back and do a little self-analysis. Or what other, what are the modalities within which I all of my texts, am I only doing all print-based texts? Am I allowing students to see the range of ways that we communicate now in the media? Are they looking at social media critically? Are they looking at the way we use AI? I think we have a lot of opinions about the hysterical nature of the AI dialogue right now in education. But are we encouraging young people through the things that we choose to teach them, the kinds of values, the kinds of ethics, the kinds of voices, the kinds of orientations toward the world that we claim that we care about? And if we see disjunctures, which of course we will, like, we are walking contradictions, we are constantly striving to do better, but we, with our students, and we don't need to do this alone, because that's one of the other things that circle all of our commitments, is that we truly have to believe in youth agency as the core of this work. If you do not believe that your students care about the world, which unfortunately we do come across many teachers that say, like, you know, civics is cool, but our kids don't really, like, they're not interested in what's going on in the world. Like, that, if that's where we start from, we'll never get anywhere. If we truly believe in the agency and the kind of hunger that Antero talked about for the kind of world that young people want to live in, if we take that seriously, then together we can actually do that inventory, and we can see what kinds of voices and what kinds of experiences that they want to see. And that could be the spark of changing our practice together.
I think I'll just briefly add that, you know, as we think about the kind of voices in our classrooms, the young people, and the inventory is one kind of example of this, that, you know, across all these activities, we need to center and take seriously what Nicole's talking about, take seriously the expertise of young people in classrooms, right? So much of our work and some of the examples in this book really drive this idea that, you know, we take seriously the fact that young people are geniuses, right? That teachers are brilliant, and that our profession and our society has done so much to deprofessionalize what this field looks like, and to recognize young people as not fully developed in their ideas or their reasoning. But we think elementary kids, high school kids, you know, that they're brilliant, and we need to bring their expertise alongside us. So as we do this inventory, we need to think through, you know, where are the spaces where the voices in our classroom are showing up in our curriculum? Where are they driving some of the conversation that's happening as well? So I just want to make sure that that's coming across as well.
I love that. And as we get to sort of closing here, I think ending with this idea of like youth as being drivers in that, and sort of that outer circle, as you talk about, is a great place to sort of reorient our mindset. As we close, are there, you know, things you want educators to be thinking about moving forward? Maybe what's next for your work? Any last things you would want to share?
I'll just say, oh man, it feels weird to go first though. I will say just briefly that if you take a look at the book, and I think there's a bunch of excerpts online of different parts of the book, you know, each chapter, each of these commitments take up a chapter of the book, and each of the commitments starts with a kind of starting small, right? So if some of these ideas sound lofty, oh, of course these professors get to talk about democracy in classrooms, right? We have kind of actionable small steps for every classroom, right? And that and for you to kind of dabble in inquiry or dabble in storytelling is a perfectly valid way to work towards making your classroom and your school space freer, right? So I just want to recognize that feeling like this feels too lofty or aspirational, I disagree, right? And there's an opportunity to kind of think through, like, how might you start small if this feels like a big step?
Yeah, and I guess to just build on that, not only starting small, but the urgency of you need to start now. And I know we talked a little bit about the gentle yet increasingly forceful prodding that has now become the theme of this conversation. But I really do believe, I think our work and what we're planning on doing into the future is just truly amidst all the constraints. And this is why we also try to speak to administrators and to leadership, because teachers shouldn't have to bear this burden alone, especially in places where there's very real threats about them, like losing their jobs over doing this work. So that we can't ask teachers to stick their necks out by themselves. But the system of public education really needs to, and we're pushing for this kind of, like, we need to have a serious reckoning about what the purpose of public education in this country is. And so as we start small, we must start, because we see the world around us, and we see that the ethical, and we need to be clear about the fact that this is not moral relativism. This is not like, let's all like believe whatever we want to believe, and there are bedrock ethical commitments that we need to be not afraid anymore to stand as a field of public education and say that like justice and equity are things that if we are not on the same page about, those voices are not appropriate for public education, because if we don't do that, we're going to keep spinning our wheels. And I think it's time for teachers and young people to see that we are serious about supporting them to build a more empathetic and compassionate world. And the only way we can do that is if we truly kind of stop, we will all, even if we're not living in a place right now where we're experiencing direct threats to our practice, like that day is coming and we need to be ready together to stand up. And this is just one little piece that can help in that journey for teachers to get started.
I love that. Start small, but start now. I think that that's a really useful mindset to have. Thank you both so much for being here. This has been incredible. And I really hope that your book makes it far and wide, because I think it's a really great place for teachers to be and to dive into. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.